Hello, human rights policing class. Welcome to week 5. Make sure you read the introduction to our week in Canvas. Um, Y'all are doing a very good job so far. This discussion board, I lightened it up a little bit. I think they're pretty extensive, some of those discussion boards. So I'm looking for quality. And so I have you responding to 5 of the 8 items in discussion board this week. And so right now I'm just going to talk a little bit about our next chapter, chapter 3 of our book that we're reading, Human Rights Policing, Reimagining Law Enforcement in the 21st Century. And so as you know, the title of chapter 3 is Power or Police Power, Agency, and Human Rights. And so I start off, with the age-old question is, who watches the watchmen, right? Who watches the overseers? And that becomes a real big problem. And so I talk a little bit about some of the whistleblowers that we've seen, people like Edward Snowden in Russia right now, and Julian Assange as well. And basically, one of the points is anybody who exposes power, the full power of the state crushes down on them. And so, um, anyone who stands against power, anyone who stands against authority, anyone who stands against institutional hierarchical domination. Usually they're murdered or they're killed or they're imprisoned or they're what they call canceled. Of course, you have the soft cancels, which is you demonetize people, you censor their speech. You kick them off of things like YouTube or Twitter, things like that. Those would be kind of soft cancels. But when people really challenge power, there's what's called hard cancels, where the government, including the United States government, will assassinate them, or they'll murder them, or they'll put them in prison or one of the American gulags around the world, put them in black sites, make them disappear. And certainly people that expose the meat and dairy industry for all of their horrible crimes around the world. Those people are considered basically domestic terrorists who lose their right to due process, and they can just be disappeared right here in our own country. And so it becomes very dangerous then to threaten any type of institutional power, especially any type of institution that's arranged like a hierarchy where power is at the top and the lower you go in that hierarchy, power decreases. And really in these institutional hierarchies, which really defines our world today, almost every institution today is hierarchical with power and domination at the top. And the lower you go within that institution, the weaker and more powerless you become. And so certainly standing up to our masters, standing up to institutional domination, standing up to authority, standing up to power becomes very dangerous. We're supposed to just agree with authority. We're supposed to agree with orthodoxy. We're supposed to agree with the status quo, no matter how much it's against our interests, in particular our class interests. And so I think Julian Assange and Edward Snowden are 2 really good examples. Of course, there's many more. Malcolm X murdered. Martin Luther King murdered. What did they do? They stood up to the American government. They stood up to power. They stood up to racism and inequality and social injustice. And when you do those things, you get murdered. And unfortunately, it's always been anytime human beings fight for their rights, whether it's for animal rights or environmental rights or women's rights or black rights or immigrant rights or any type of rights, it's usually the police that are there to crack their skulls and put them in prison. And so that's why I've said in one of my previous lectures that the purpose of the police is to uphold class inequality. Whenever you have people standing up, fighting power, fighting for their rights, fighting for equality, it makes the billionaires and the master class or the ruling class uncomfortable. And so the police go and sick them basically and crack some skulls, put some bodies in cages and leave them there to rot, sometimes forever. And so it becomes very important. And then there's even a part where in that chapter, in that section where you had some whistleblowers that exposed the criminals like Bill Gates and other criminals like that who do not pay their taxes. People like Elon Musk who do not pay their taxes, and a lot of other billionaires who do not pay their taxes. They don't pay their share. We all have to, the burden of paying taxes is on the working classes and the middle classes. It's on us. The billionaire class, the master class, they don't pay taxes. And so when you had some journalists, I think with ProPublica, that exposed that the ruling class, that the wealthy elite do not pay taxes. The Biden administration, instead of fixing this problem, they tried to put those journalists that expose these crimes in prison. That's what they did. They tried to put these journalists in prison for exposing the truth. And so you never go to jail. You never get in trouble for telling lies, really. You get in trouble for telling the truth. That's when you become dangerous. So important chapter there. Then we define power, which is a very important sociological concept. And in today's world, we achieve power not so much through our own personal sense of charisma, or not so much through traditional means like God willed it. Why does the king have the right to rule? Well, because God wills it. That's why, right? Um, Rather, our power, we obtain our power through our attachment to an institution. And so, a priest, regardless of his flock, has no, may or may not be charismatic, and may or may not have a large flock, but they still have the power to administer salvation simply because of their attachment to an institution like the Catholic Church. A police officer might be strong and courageous or weak and pathetic. It doesn't really matter. Their power does not derive from their personal attributes, but rather their power derives from their attachment or affiliation to an institution. Same thing with my ability to profess, to be a professor. It doesn't necessarily come from my ability to do a good job or a bad job. It has to do with my attachment to an institution. And so long I have that attachment to an institution, or police have that attachment to an institution, or a priest has that attachment to an institution, they will have power. Once they're no longer attached to that institution, that power evaporates. So it's really important to see where power comes from. And generally, to speaking, in our society, power comes from hierarchical institutions of power and domination, and that's where people get their power. And the moment that they're stripped from their powerful positions in institutions, they are no longer powerful. And so Biden, even though he is by most people's accounts, senile, and can't really walk off stages, mutters to himself. Um, he still has power simply because of his attachment to an institution like the United States government. And so it's very important then to understand where power comes from and how it's used. And so I have that child that and I also have that line from Smedley Butler, who talks about power as well, and he was talking about the United States military. And pay attention to this line because it's this quote I think is really important. Where he says, "I spent 33 years and 4 months in active military service, and during that period, I spent most of my time in a as a high-class muscle man for big business, for Wall Street, the bankers. In short, I was a racketeer, a gangster for capitalism. I helped make Mexico, especially Tampico, safe for American oil interests in 1914. I helped make Haiti and Cuba a decent place for the National City Bank boys to collect revenues in. I helped in the raping of half a dozen Central American republics to collect revenues in. I helped in I helped purify Nicaragua for the International Banking House of Brown Brothers in 1902 to 1912. I brought light to the Dominican Republic for the American sugar interests in 1916. I helped make Honduras right for the American Fruit Company in 1903. In China in 1927, I helped to see it that Standard Oil went on its way unmolested. Looking back on it, I might have given Al Capone a few hints. The best he could have done was operate his racket in 3 districts. I operated on 3 continents. To end more, we have to take the profit out of war. And so this is Smedley Butler, who is a decorated military veteran who admits that when the United States, when American corporations who own the United States government, when American corporations, when they want their wealth, when they want their profit, when they want to use their power, they use their vehicle, which is the United States military, to go and terrorize, to bomb, to destroy, to flatten countries, to destroy democracies all around the world, in order to expand not only from sea to shining sea of this idea of men manifest destiny, but to expand across the entire globe. And so American corporations have destroyed everything and anything in its path to exploit everyone and everything for endless profit. And how do they do it? They use the United States military. Now that's power. And so there's that section on what is power. And then we have where does power derive? And that's where I talk about traditional authority, rational legal authority, which is the type of authority that we have today, the dominant type of authority where, as I alluded to earlier, it's your authority that's attached to an institution. And then I discuss charismatic authority. And this is from the ideas of the classical sociologist, Max Weber. Then I talk about one of those age-old philosophical debates, human agency versus determinism. Give that a good look, because I think that's very important. Um, Most of the social sciences are based upon the assumption that human beings do not have any type of human agency or free will, but rather that they're determined. And determinism can come in two forms. And in fact, it does come in two forms. One is that we're determined by our inner unruly biological forces, or in other words, our instincts, that our instincts determine our behavior. And then the other form of determinism is um, that we are determined by the great external structural forces that are operating upon us and pushing and shaping, determining our behavior a certain way. So because of these inner unruly biological instinctual forces and these external kind of cultural structural forces impinging themselves upon us, that human beings simply do not have any free will or agency. In fact, a lot of philosophers would say that one of the greatest illusions of human beings is that they have any free will whatsoever, that they make any choices whatsoever. They would argue that human beings have never made a choice, that a human being has never made a choice, that a human being is simply determined to do what they do, and that choice is an illusion. On the other hand, you have this idea of human agency, which is kind of like a limited free will. Obviously, I'm not a theologian, so I'm not going to talk about, when I'm, at least when I'm talking to you, I'm not a theologian, I'm a sociologist, so I'm not going to talk about the theology of free will or not. But I will say that free will as a sociological concept is impossible, but rather most sociologists would say, or at least many sociologists would say, that we have limited free will. And so agency is our ability to go against these inner unruly biological instinctual forces and to do something completely unexpected. Agency is the ability to go against these great structural forces impinging themselves upon our behavior and to do something completely against it, to go against the grain of our biology and go against the grain of our culture, to become something else, to allow our subjectivity to emerge and we become something completely unexpected against all societal expectations. And I would argue basically that um, although all beings, I would say all conscious sentient beings, whether it's a dog or a cat or an ant or a pig or a human or an ape, it doesn't matter, bird, um, that we all possess the ability for human agency, but we very rarely, if ever, use it. But at least that potential is there. And with that potential, at least it kind of gives hope that we can go upon another trajectory. I think one example of using agency would be actually applying human rights. And of course, human rights have never been applied in any institution throughout all of history. Human rights is simply an idea that has never been practiced. And I would argue it's a right that has never been meaningfully valued, because if it was meaningfully valued, then you would see human beings practicing it. And I think in any type of hierarchical institution, whether it's a university or it's a military or it's a religion, human rights simply does not exist in actual practice. And in order for human rights to actually exist in practice, then we would have to use our sense of human agency. And so really consider that. I think that's very important. And ask yourself, have you ever used your sense of human agency? Was there a time that you think you could have and you didn't? Do you think you'll ever use your sense of agency in the future? Just questions to ask yourself. But we have one example of that could have been human agency, and that's that section on human agency and policing, a story from inside the NOPD. And here my father put that together, and I think he did a really good job. And I also got other police officers to talk about when they used their sense of agency as well. So police officer David Pell from the University of Wisconsin-La Crosse, right here. He wrote a little excerpt there. So I think you'll enjoy that. And it's also personal because he's a police officer right on your campus. And then I talk at the end, threats to human rights policing, moral panics and manufacturing of folk devils. This is very important because how are deviants created? How are folk devils created? And of course, folk devils are people that have been scapegoated for larger structural problems. And you can see that all the time, you know. Why is America getting destroyed right now? Oh, well, some people say, well, it's the immigrants. The immigrants are coming in and they're destroying the United States. That would be one example of creating this folk devil. And there's all these moral panics behind the folk devil. And so it gets people to attack usually the institutionally vulnerable and the institutionally weak, like undocumented people who can't defend themselves. And so instead of blaming our our problems in this country on structural contradictions or problems that are going on in the institutional arrangements of society, that requires then radical social transformation to fix that problem. Instead of doing that, we find the easiest people to pick on, to demonize, to scapegoat, and to make devils and social pariahs, and we blame them for all of our problems. Um, Certainly, we've seen that with inner city Black youth. Racists like Hillary Clinton have called young Black men super predators. Biden has said he doesn't want his children growing up in a racial drunk jungle. Trump said that the Mexicans are some bad hombres. So you can see then more of this kind of this media creation of the folk devil, and it becomes very powerful because people believe these things, mainly because are the multimedia conglomerates, and there is no free, basically, there's no free press in the United States. It's controlled by basically five gangs, five cartels, or five multimedia conglomerates that control all the information you've ever received. And their job is not to give you the news, but is rather to propagate information to you so that you'll go along with the status quo. You'll go along with the ruling ideology. And so you'll believe that it's the Black people, it's the immigrants that are the problem. Most Americans have never met anybody from the Middle East. I've traveled to them throughout the Middle East extensively. And I can tell you right now, there's a lot of beauty and beautiful people, throughout the Middle East, whether it's Qatar or United Arab Emirates or it's Iraq or Afghanistan or Yemen or Palestine or any of those countries. Yet they've become demonized, that they are some type of an external threat. And so we've made them folk devils as well. We've done the same thing to Russia as well. Russia that, they defeated, for the Americans, they defeated the Germans. I mean, you probably brought it to believe that the United States defeated Germany. It was the Russians that defeated Germany. And they lost over 20 million people doing so. And so in many ways, the United States projects their own ugly shadow onto Putin and Russia and have scapegoated Russia as the biggest problem facing the world today, when Russia was not the one to really expand. It was NATO that began to expand. Well, I won't get into that whole story, but nonetheless, you can see here how people become made into folk devils and they become scapegoated for large-scale structural problems. And so it becomes very important. Um, and uh, so there's a few pages on that. And then I end, which I think is something very interesting. You can watch it yourself, that the British, I guess it's called a show, I don't know, Black Mirror. There's one called Men Against Fire. If any, I don't know if it's on one of those Netflix or HBO, I don't know what it is, but you can probably watch it. And I give a little story of Black Mirror, Men Against Fire, just to show how powerful this idea of scapegoating can be and how it has real and oftentimes devastating consequences. For example, once young Black men and women, inner city Black men and women were scapegoated, this led to the United States creating the largest prison industrial complex that the world has ever known. And of course, as we well know, the United States imprisons, incarcerates, and tortures more human beings than any other country in the world, more than Russia, more than North Korea, more than China. And so how many young men and women, have been put into prison, separated from their families, separated from their young ones, their lives destroyed, often for nonviolent offenses. It's one of the most cruelest things I've ever witnessed or observed in my life, the American prison industrial complex. If, as Kurt Vonnegut says, if that's not a sin, I don't know what is. And then so you have the discussion board that's based upon those readings. And so um, I said to those lighten it up. So respond to five of the eight items. And so you can talk about one, the philosophical foundations of where I discussed in the beginning of the chapter. Then whistleblowers and human rights. That's two. Three, media, propaganda, and manufacturing consent. And here I borrow a lot from Chomsky, who wrote that famous book with Herman on manufacturing consent. And then I talk about power in various institutions for the discussion board. Five is I mentioned the Stanford prison experiment. basically that argues that when anybody enters into a position, occupies a position of power, then they take the role of the dominator, of the powerful, of the oppressive. And it almost happens 100% of the time in any institutional hierarchy. No matter how small and insignificant someone has, of power someone has, they will use that power to abuse others. And then they'll find some type of justification or ideology that makes their oppressive behavior seem justifiable. Um, then we have human agency and countering power abuse. That's item 6. 7 was the moral panics and policing, and 8 is folk devils and dehumanization. So I put a lot of thought into these discussion boards, and so I hope you enjoyed. And as you well know, I give you quite extensive feedback. In fact, I give a lot of feedback, but I hope that you find that helpful. And certainly email if you have any questions about anything. I'm always available to you. So enjoy another week. Keep it strong and appreciate y'all. Take care.